Imagine like your YouTube channel just exploding out of like its little local bubble and reaching a global audience.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it, collaborating with creators from all over the world, those people you've been following for, I don't know, like forever. Maybe even hosting a fan meetup in like London or Tokyo. I mean, that's the dream, right? For English-speaking creators, the potential is huge. It's like a whole world waiting to discover your content.
Absolutely.
But there's often this kind of like tricky thing that stands in the way of making those dreams a reality. Visas.
Visas, yeah.
Yeah, visas. And for English-speaking YouTubers who are really serious about that whole international expansion thing, understanding how the visa process works is so important.
It really is. It's not just some boring paperwork. It's a fundamental part of growing globally. I mean, without the right permission to be in a country, those exciting possibilities you were talking about, they can turn into legal nightmares pretty quickly.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're diving deep into today. We've got a couple of really interesting sources to help us unpack all this. First up, we've got this article, and it lays out the whole visa landscape, like specifically for YouTubers, like a roadmap. You know?
Yeah, a roadmap for sure.
And then we've got this really cool segment from an English language learning podcast. It's a dialogue, like a mock visa interview. I think it's going to give us some like really practical, on-the-ground insights.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how these two sources kind of work together. The article gives us that broad overview, different visa categories and the basic requirements, and then the podcast puts us right there in the hot seat, especially when it comes to the interview process. It gets pretty real.
So what's our mission today? Well, we're going to dig into these sources, pull out the most important info, and make it crystal clear for you, the listener. We want you to walk away with a solid understanding of how to get a visa as a content creator.
Exactly. No legal jargon, just the practical stuff you need to know. Because when you think about it, getting the right visa, it's not just checking a box. It's what allows you to travel, to collaborate with other creators, to attend all those cool industry events around the world, and ultimately to grow your channel on a global scale.
Right. Without those permissions, even the most amazing opportunities might hit a wall, a legal wall. So let's get down to business. Visas. We all know they exist, but why are they so crucial for content creators who want to take their work international?
So essentially, a visa is like an official permission slip from a country. It lets you, a foreign national, enter, stay in, or even just pass through that country. Now, for YouTubers, especially those who are going to be working while they're abroad, having the right visa is absolutely essential.
Working abroad?
Yeah, like if you're filming, collaborating with other YouTubers, or even earning money from your content while you're in another country, you got to have the right visa. Otherwise, you could get into some serious trouble.
Trouble like deportation.
Or even restrictions on traveling to that country in the future.
Yikes. That's definitely something you want to avoid. Okay, so we get the why, but the world of visas can be a bit of a jungle. Tourist visas, work visas, student visas. Where should a YouTuber even start?
Right, well, the article we looked at talked about a few key categories. First, there's the tourist visa, which is often called the B2 visa, especially if you're going to the US. The podcast dialogue also focused on the B2.
Okay.
This type of visa is basically for short trips, like vacations, visiting family, that kind of thing. You can probably attend a conference on a B2 visa, or even film some background shots for your travel vlogs, but you're not allowed to work.
So no sponsored videos or like setting up a big collaboration?
No, not on a tourist visa. For that, you need to look into work visas. These are designed for people who are going to a country specifically to work. Now, for YouTubers who have a big following and make decent money from their channel, the article mentions the O1 visa.
O1?
Yeah, it's for individuals with extraordinary ability in their field, like arts, sciences, even business. If a YouTuber can prove they're at the top of their game, have a huge impact, and are super recognized in their niche, the O1 could be a good option.
Extraordinary ability. So like creators with millions of subscribers, awards, maybe even media coverage.
Exactly. Think about proving your content's impact goes way beyond just views. Have you won any awards, been featured in major publications, got a really engaged community? All that can make a difference.
Makes sense. What about those other visa types mentioned in the podcast? The F1 and the J1, I think.
Oh, right. Those are temporary resident visas. The F1 is for students going abroad to study. Like if you wanted to enroll in a filmmaking program in another country, that's when you'd need an F1.
Got it.
And the J1 is for exchange visitors. Think work and study programs, research exchanges, cultural programs, that kind of thing.
So even though these aren't the usual visas for established YouTubers, they could be useful in certain cases.
Yeah.
Exactly. The podcast really highlighted how there's a visa for almost every reason to travel, and each has its own rules.
It's like a whole visa menu. Okay, so different visas for different situations, we got it. But are there like some basic requirements that apply to everyone, no matter what kind of visa they're applying for?
Yeah, pretty much. The article mentions some general eligibility stuff that's pretty standard across the board. Usually you need to prove your identity.
Like a passport.
Yeah, a valid passport. And you also need to show that you're financially stable. This basically tells the country you're visiting that you can support yourself during your stay and you won't end up needing their financial help.
Right, you don't want to be seen as a financial burden, makes sense. But I'm guessing the specific requirements get a lot more complicated depending on the visa you're going for.
Right.
Absolutely. The article really stressed that the exact documents and criteria can be very different depending on the visa type. For example, if you're going for a work visa like the O1, you'll probably need a lot of documentation to prove your achievements. Things like awards, media appearances, and strong recommendation letters from people in your field.
Makes sense.
The article also mentioned that you might need proof of income, and in some cases, a sponsor.
Oh yeah, a sponsor. That came up in the podcast too, right?
It did. The podcast focused on a B2 tourist visa application, and the applicant said they had their brother, who lived in the U.S., as their sponsor.
Okay.
In that case, the brother was basically saying he takes some financial responsibility for the applicant during their visit. And he had also written an invitation letter.
Invitation letter, another important document, right?
Yeah, invitation letters are pretty common for different visa types. It's basically a formal letter from someone in the country you're visiting, like a family member, friend, or even a business contact. They're formally inviting you to visit, and often saying why you're coming and how long you'll stay.
So it's like having someone vouch for you, whether it's your brother for a tourist visa or a company for a work visa. That can really make a difference.
Definitely.
Okay, let's say someone knows what kind of visa they need. What's the next step? Actually putting together the application? Any tips from our article on how to prepare for that?
The article really hammered home the importance of gathering all the right documents.
Like your passport, photos, financial statements, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But for YouTubers, and this is key, the article also said you might need to create a business plan.
A business plan for a YouTube channel?
Yeah. It sounds a bit formal, but it's basically about showing that your YouTube channel is a real business, not just a hobby. You explain your content, how you make money, your target audience, your plans for growth. It shows the visa authorities that you're serious and that your content could actually benefit their economy.
So it's like taking your channel to the next level, making it official.
Exactly. Okay, so you've gathered all your documents, maybe even put together a business plan. What's next?
Well, according to the article, the actual application process usually follows a pretty standard set of steps.
Okay.
You fill out detailed application forms, often online, and then you schedule and attend an interview at the embassy or consulate of the country you're applying to.
Ah, the interview. This is where the podcast gave us that really interesting behind-the-scenes look. Remember the dialogue with the visa officer interviewing the applicant for a B2 tourist visa?
Yeah, I remember.
What were some of the key questions they focused on?
One of the big ones was, where is your final destination and what is the purpose of your trip to the United States? And the podcast experts were really clear about how important it is to be specific and to make sure your answer matches exactly what you wrote on your application.
Yeah, any inconsistencies or vague answers could be a red flag for the interviewer. You can't say you're going for tourism and tell them you're actually filming a documentary.
Right, got it. What else did they ask?
Well, the interviewer also asked, how long do you plan to remain in the United States?
Okay.
And again, the podcast emphasized that your answer has to match the length of stay you wrote on your application form. Any difference could make the officer question your intentions.
Got it. Consistency is key.
Absolutely. And speaking of key questions, the podcast pointed out one question that they said was maybe the most important one in the whole interview. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, it was. Tell me about the ties you have to your home country.
That's the one. The podcast explained that this question is so important because the visa officer really wants to make sure that you plan to go back home after your visa expires.
They're looking for proof that you're not going to overstay your visa or try to immigrate illegally.
Exactly. They want to see strong evidence that you have reasons to return.
And the podcast actually gave some really clear examples of what those ties could be, right?
They did. They mentioned owning property like a house, having a pet, owning a car, having a steady job, being married, having kids, having money in a bank account. All those things show that you have a life back home.
It's about proving that you're not just going to disappear in the new country, that you've got responsibilities and reasons to go back.
Exactly. Remember the applicant in the podcast? They gave some pretty convincing examples.
They did. They mentioned owning a house, which is a big tie, and having a job as an engineer.
Right, and they said they only had 3 weeks of vacation time, so they'd have to go back to work.
And don't forget the dog. Making arrangements for their dog showed that they were definitely coming back.
All very concrete things that a visa interviewer can easily understand and relate to. Now, the podcast also mentioned financial independence and having assets. What role do those play in the application process?
Right. Both the article and the podcast emphasize how important it is to show that you can support yourself financially. The article talked about proof of income, and the podcast showed the applicant giving a bank statement with investments and a good balance.
Right. The podcast also explained what assets are. It's basically anything valuable you own back home, like your house, car, stocks, investments. It shows you're financially stable and strengthens your ties to your home country.
So it's not just about having enough money for your trip, it's about showing that you have a solid financial foundation back home. Okay, we've talked a lot about the process in the interview. Any final tips for a successful application?
The article advised applicants to be super careful and avoid common mistakes.
Like researching common reasons for visa denials.
Exactly. And the podcast had a really practical toolkit section. They recommended preparing extra documents that prove your ties to your home country, even if you're not specifically asked for them.
Like bank statements, mortgage documents, maybe even a letter from your employer.
Right. It's always better to be over-prepared and have that evidence ready just in case. It can really boost your confidence during the interview.
Absolutely. Now, the article briefly mentioned something no one really wants to think about: visa denials and appeals.
Yeah, it's important to know that applications can be denied. The article suggested being familiar with the appeals process if one exists for your visa type.
Right.
And it also emphasized finding reliable immigration law resources if you run into problems or if your situation is complicated.
Definitely good advice. Speaking of complicated, the podcast dialogue took a rather unexpected turn at the end, didn't it?
It did. The applicant was not only granted a tourist visa, but also a resident visa, and was declared the millionth applicant. They even won a prize, but the podcast hosts said this would never happen in real life.
It was definitely memorable. But I think the real takeaway for our listeners is to focus on the practical advice the podcast gave, not on winning some imaginary lottery.
Totally agree. The important lessons are about preparing thoroughly, being consistent, and proving your ties to your home country. Those are the things that really matter.
So to wrap things up, it's clear that for English-speaking YouTubers who want to go global, understanding the visa process is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, if you're dreaming of reaching an international audience, start thinking about what visas might be right for you. And remember, proving your strong ties to your home country is going to be super important for a successful application.
And here's a final thought for you to ponder. As more and more creators become digital nomads and the lines between work and travel blur, what changes might we see in visa policies in the future? How will they adapt to this new world of online content creation? It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
It is. It'll be interesting to see how things evolve.
Absolutely.